Hello from London, England. This is going to be a talk on governing the ungovernable. Now, you'll notice that that's in quotes because nothing is truly ungovernable, but I want to talk about what I'm calling one giant leap for the root server system in 2021, the year just gone. It was a big year for the root server system, and I'm going to explain why. Now, to begin, you might know this already, but here's the high points. I'm a lawyer. I've been working with the internet and information technology for 30 years. I've been teaching legal and regulatory aspects of cybersecurity for 20 years, and I was closely involved in assisting with the development of the RSAC document that I'm going to be discussing later in this presentation. I'll spend more time talking to you about all of that. And of course, the big old legal disclaimer, all of my comments are personal, do not necessarily represent the opinions of anybody, possibly not even myself. Now, today's agenda, I'm going to take us through three things. I first want to give a brief history of the root server system. And when I say brief, I mean brief, and it's going to be as told by a lawyer. I'm then going to talk about an effort by a sovereign state to regulate the root server system, specifically the draft EU NIS2 Directive, and then I'll be walking you through essentially the success criteria that were developed for root server system governance in RSAC 058. So those are our 3 points. Now, to begin, this is incredibly dangerous. I'm about to talk to a room full of experts about a highly technical subject which I can claim only limited understanding. So I'm going to do this in a way on the assumption that there might be 1 or 2 people in the room, like me, who are lawyers who would like an explanation. So since I'm only going to explain this for people like me who are lawyers, I thought the simplest way to do it would be to reduce it to a Socratic dialogue. And as I'm sure you all know, a Socratic dialogue is where an old and crusty professor asks questions of a young and eager student. Questions like, so, where can I find the IP address of www.example.com? The student, being a good student, says, that's easy. Ask the authoritative server for the domain example.com. Now, Socrates is not to be put off by that and says, where can I find the IP address of the authoritative server for the domain example.com? To which Plato replies, why, you just ask the authoritative server for the .com top-level domain. All right. Next question from the professor. Where can I find the IP address of the authoritative server for the .com top-level domain? To which the answer is, all you need to do is ask any one of the root servers in the root server system. The root server system, the RSS. Okay, because a root server system does what? A root server does what? A root server publishes to the world the contents of the root zone, which is to say a list of IP addresses, the IP number addresses of the authoritative servers for each and every top-level domain registry. And who operates the root servers? See, this is truly an example of an easy question. The root server operators are the people who operate the root servers. And very good, you get that kind of a cookie. Now this is where the student turns things around on the professor and says, hang on a second. We've talked about what the root server system is, but who are these root server operators? At this point, the professor takes a sidestep and says, well, that's not Socratic dialogue, that's merely a recitation of history. So let us look at the great scroll of history of the RSS, or as we call it, RSAC 023. And we find that the very first root server for DNS as we know it was set up in 1984 by John Postel and Paul Macapetris at the University of Southern California. And we find that by the end of 1985, there wasn't just one root server, there were 4. 2 of them at the university, 1 at SRI, and 1 at the Ballistic Research Lab, U.S. Army. Now, a few more years roll by, 1991, there's only 6 root servers and 6 RSOs. And October 91 is a special time for me. That was when I sent and received my first ever internet email. Now, in 1994, the organization I work for, ISC, suddenly appears in this club with ns.isc.org. And by 1995, there are 9 root servers and 9 RSOs. That was also the year that they were renamed to rootservers.net with the lettering scheme A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I. So what happens next? It's a little bit more of the same. 1997, the system added letters J, K, L, M, and as you can see in that same year, K ended up with ripe in Europe, M ended up with wide in Japan. In 1998, ICANN was founded. Wow! Gosh, we're 14 years after the establishment of the first root server, and now ICANN is founded, and that same year, LRoot moves to ICANN. A couple years later, VeriSign acquires NSI. With it, they acquire ARoot and JRoot. iRoot moves to NetNod. Cogent acquires PSINet and gets CRoot. And that's kind of it, really. I mean, from 2002 until today, for 20 years, that's kind of the entire group. No one really changes identity after that. Meanwhile, changes to the surrounding environment. In 2002, FRoot, our organization, NIS2, the first root server to be anycasted internationally. Eventually, just about everyone follows. I think now everyone has followed that practice. And then in 2014 to 16, something incredibly important happens. The IANA function transitions from the US government to ICANN. So, who do we see today? January 2022, I should say February 2022. As of today, here's your list of 13 letters, 12 root server operators, and their corresponding IP address numbers. Total statistics, 12 operators use the 13 letter addresses. Those addresses resolve to more than 1,450 root server instances. The number's over 1,480. If you want to point your browser at root-servers.net, you can get the exact count as of right now. Those root server instances are located in more than 100 sovereign states. They operate 24/365 without interruption. They've done so for 30 years, and they do one thing. They publish the root zone to the world at no charge. Pretty good system, pretty stable. It's worked very well for a very long time. Step 2 of our talk today. I'm going to slow the pace down because now I'm talking about something slightly different. This is a piece of legislation, NIS2, which I'm calling the accidental, maybe, RSS killer, possibly, or at least maybe that was, maybe it would have, maybe it would not have. Time, not quite there yet. All right, what am I talking about? Those of you who don't follow legislation, and with any luck, that's most of you, because who wants to do that other than someone like me? The first NIS directive, as many of you probably already know, came around in 2016, and basically it was a European directive where the European Union said to its member states, hey, cybersecurity is kind of important, especially where critical national infrastructure is concerned. So why don't all of you pull yourself together and raise the standards a bit? Let's raise the bar. Let's actually try to secure critical national infrastructure throughout the European Union. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, NIS1 did not apply to DNS services as such. Now roll the clock forward to late 2020, and everyone kind of realizes, you know what, NIS1 isn't really going far enough. We need to be much more aggressive about what we think of as critical and what we think of as things we rely on and trust. And so NIS2, a draft law, it's still draft, it hasn't been passed yet, it is still draft. Draft comes out in late 2020, and it includes DNS services, along with a lot of other things. DNS is a small part of NIS2, and the root server system is an even smaller part of NIS2, just a part that's very important to root server operators. This draft law specifically targets, calls out, names, describes root servers as a subject for regulation. And although this law has a small business exception, the small business exception does not apply to root servers in the late 2020 draft of the law. So why was this, or why is this? I'm not quite sure which of those two words is correct yet. Why was it a problem? It's a problem because of the geographic scope of the regulation. The Commission draft in 2020 would mandate the regulation of everyone who provides root server services to people in the European Union. This formulation should start to sound familiar to many of you who follow the European Union and its legislative process, but that's a story for a different day or for the question and answer session. So The problem, of course, is that the root server system is a globally unified system, massively distributed, highly resilient service. And all 12 root server operators maintain some equipment that is located in the European Union. People in the European Union consult root servers that are geolocated both inside and outside the European Union, and they consult root servers that are operated by all 12 of the RSOs. So the bottom line of why is this a problem is that regulating people who operate root servers delivering service to people in the EU means regulating all 12 of them. So we're talking about everybody in the organization. So why is that a problem, Rob? What's wrong with regulating root server operators? Okay, here it is. The slippery slope of, let's say, one national regulation. And even under the directive, it wouldn't be one. Because under the directive says that EU member states, 27 of them, can each, theoretically, regulate the RSS. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be all 27, but it's going to be more than one, for reasons we can talk about. Well, if these 27 sovereign states have the authority and the right and the obligation to regulate the root server system, why not sovereign states number 28, 29, 30, all the way up to 192, which is the number that I chose because I believe it's the number of states that are full members of the United Nations today? What's wrong with that picture? The risk of conflicting standards, reporting requirements, etc., eventually would create operating pressure to fracture the RSS along national borderlines. And that threatens the unity and the resilience of the RSS. And besides, isn't this the type of issue that the multi-stakeholder model is designed to resolve? Don't we have a solution for this problem already? Why create a problem that we have already solved? Now, I do wonder if that was intentional. And the reason I wonder about that is there is some evidence that maybe some people inside the European Commission, maybe it wasn't their intention to regulate all 12 global RSOs. Some of the foundation documents that they prepared only talk about the 2 RSOs whose center of business is in the European Union. Some of the informal discussions with staff and contact meetings suggested that they didn't quite understand why we were concerned. There seemed to be some suggestion that they weren't sure they were regulating anyone except those 2. But even regulating those 2, I would argue, creates the same problem we're talking about because it's a globally unified system. Even so, enter the European Parliament. The European Parliament, more than 700 members of the European Parliament, specifically a committee charged with looking at this particular law, and a member of the European Parliament who acted as the rapporteur for this particular piece of law, draft law. And the European Parliament works differently from the US Congress. In the European Parliament, they don't have 1,000 staff members who do everything for them. They actually find someone who sits and votes and argues and talks and says, hey, why don't you go work on this for a while and draft a report. And the guy who did it, I really encourage you to read this report. Any of you who are worried about NIS2 in your businesses, and I should say many of you might need to be worried about NIS2 in your businesses, should have a look at this report. It's very good. One of the very first things this gentleman said in his report was this: root name servers should be out of scope from the law, because regulating them is contrary to the EU's own vision of a single, open, neutral, free, secure, and unfragmented network. Reason 2, if we regulate them, it could encourage and empower other states. Which other states? Other states who advocate for a top-down, state-controlled governance approach instead of multi-stakeholder. Now, this is a really polite way. In fact, I'm surprised at how strongly worded this is, given that this is a legislator in the European Parliament. But this is, I interpret this to mean, hey, we shouldn't regulate this because we could break the internet. And let's not do that, please. The parliamentary committee said, yep, we're completely on board with the whole report, and they voted 70-3 in favor of it, so pretty popular. And the parliamentary redraft came out in November of 2021. They not only removed the references to root servers, they actually wrote into the draft law, their draft version of the law, root servers are not included. I mean, that's not the exact words, but that's the gist of it. That's the legal impact of it. And so now the question comes up, what happens next? Well, what happens next is the European Parliament sits down with the European Council, or at least representatives of both of those groups, and they try to reach an agreement on exactly what the directive is going to say. They're aided by the European Commission, which is why these are called the trilogue discussions. We're keeping an eye on that this year, and we'll see what happens next. Now that's what happens when sovereign states start looking at the problem of governance. What happens when the governed themselves start looking at the problem of governance? So here, what we see, or what I want to tell you, is a little story about root server system governance, what's been happening with it, and what was a pretty big deal about this last year. Okay, let's begin with the RSS governance challenge. See, the thing you need to remember is that the root servers are not directly incorporated within the overall ICANN governance structure. Now, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully because I don't want you to read either too much or too little into that statement. The root server operators effectively take as the ultimate source of truth the root zone as published by IANA. We don't decide what's in or out of the root zone. That's not the job. The job is publishing the root zone as it's handed to us. So the root server operators themselves live in a slightly different position to a lot of other people at the bottom of internet architecture. So we have this governance challenge. Someone makes the observation, there is no governance structure for the RSS. I've heard people say this. Or is there? Foreshadowing. Okay. First, I'm going to talk about one small step. And by the way, when I use this, I just want to go from one small step to one giant leap. In fact, I'm really not giving this next slide does not give nearly enough credit to what happened here. The root server operators over a 3-year period basically recognized, hey, we really need to do something about governance. I mean, bear in mind, remember, 2014 to 2016 is when IANA is transitioning over to ICANN. So this is about the same time that the RSOs say, hey, we need to do something to formalize, to bring forward, to crystallize to our governance structure. They go through a series of workshops during that 3-year period, and that results in the publication of something called RSAC 037. RSAC 037, RSAC, yeah. That's the Root Server System Advisory Committee, for those of you who don't play, ICANN bingo. The Root Server System Advisory Committee. It is a group of people who exist to give advice to the ICANN board, as well as issue publications of concern related to the root server system. It has 12 voting seats, 12 RSOs, 12 voting seats. That was not an accident. Plus a whole series of ICANN liaisons, observers, staff, people to come and make representations and give information and get information. It's a good thing, and it's a very formal body with formal rules. So RSAC 037, a proposed governance model for the DNS root server system, 50 pages. I mean, this is a pretty hefty document. It has a lot of stuff in it. It's a very, very good read. Plus 038, an accompanying document which is 3 specific recommendations to the ICANN board saying, hey, ICANN board, we just wrote this big document about governance, and here are 3 things we think you should do. Marvelous. So what does the ICANN board do? Well, responding to those recommendations, say, hey, great recommendations. Thank you, RSAC. They do a couple of things. After spending some time in public consultations, they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to charter a special ad hoc group, a committee, whatever you want to call it. The Root Server System Governance Working Group, the RSS GWG. I'm going to be saying the letters GWG a lot for the rest of this talk, so might as well just settle in now. The ICANN board gives the GWG, the RSS Governance Working Group, the task of proposing a model root server system governance structure that takes account of RSAC 037, another document called RSAC 042, and a bunch of other stuff. So what happens? Well, whenever you charter a group like this, it takes some time to figure out who's going to be seated at the table. Various communities have to appoint people, all that kind of good stuff. They started work in January 2020, and early in 2021, they produced a draft model. A draft model. Not their final output. They produce a draft, and they start getting the idea of, let's expose this a little bit. Now, the root server operators, all of them, read the draft model, and that's when things started to get really interesting really fast. So the reason things get interesting is because the draft model produced by the GWG early in 2021 has actually drifted pretty far from RSAC 037. I mean, that's my opinion. Other people might say, well, it's a little closer to RSAC 37. It's not that far. It's a little far. Well, amongst the RSOs, the feeling was this doesn't really seem to have taken close account of 037 and 042 and a bunch of other things. So the question becomes, how are we going to structure a productive conversation with GWG? How do we push this forward? Option one, everyone shout at each other. No, I mean, that's as fun as that can be sometimes. No, that's not the way to, to be grown up about it and advance the cause. Option two, which was a very heartfelt and sincere suggestion, was, well, if you don't like that model, let's look at this other model. Or here's something else we have on the shelf that does something else. What do you think about this other model? And that actually prompted an interesting inquiry, which led to looking at option three. How would we know the difference between a good model and one that wasn't good? If we're shown two different models, what system would we use to choose between them? Is it just sort of like, oh, I feel better about this, or I feel worse about the other? So option three is, why don't we retire a little bit and spend some time creating our own framework to analyze proposals like this? And that is, draw up a list of what the RSOs believe a good model should look like, and then use that list to develop a structured dialogue. At least that way you can create an agenda and go through things one step at a time. And option three is precisely what was chosen. Now, this wasn't what we thought would happen when we started the discussions, but the end result was two new RSAC publications. RSAC 058, Success Criteria for the RSS Governance Structure, 21 pages long, and an accompanying recommendation, 4 recommendations. Now, one thing I should emphasize is that I'm relatively new to the ICANN governance universe, but I'm told that this is pretty good speed in terms of coming up with something this complex. From the first informal discussions among RSOs to the final output, which was a unanimous 12-0 approval vote of both RSAC 058 and 059, in a very formal sense by the Root Server System Advisory Committee. More than 22 hours of meetings and workshops spread out over 15 online sessions, very well attended. I mean, we never had fewer than 15 people in the room, and a few of them we had as many as 40. All of that was done and dusted and adopted in 7 calendar months, which I'm told is pretty speedy for something this complicated. But I have to say, what made it go that fast was the way that the RSOs very quickly coalesced around some key messages. So, this went over to the ICANN board immediately when they were published, and within a couple of days of publication, the ICANN board held a special session, and they said, essentially, this is a shorthand, yeah, we like these. Yeah, good going. And they transmitted those documents with a covering note, an endorsement, a bit of a guidance note, sent it over to our friends at GWG and said, here's some documents. Now, I'll tell you more about what happened with GWG at the very end of the talk. Before I do that, I want to spend a little time talking about what's actually in these success criteria, or what is in RSAC 058. First of all, the document implicitly acknowledges a current reality that we can tease out by asking this question. Is there an RSS governance structure today? Is there one right now? To answer that question, let's look at the difference between a technical standard and a governance structure. A technical standard describes what technical systems do. A governance structure describes what people are supposed to do. In other words, a governance structure is something that influences the behavior of people. And you ask yourself the question, is there something that currently influences the behavior of the people who run the root server system? And the answer is, yes, it's a governance structure. Well, it's governance, Jim, but not as we know it. What does it look like? If you look at RSAC 058 section 1.2, you will find this recitation of a history of governance success. The root server operators acting under three conditions: acting collectively with each other, collaboratively with other stakeholders, while remaining independent, those are the three conditions, have had three indicia of success, have defined the core principles that govern how the root service should operate, have delivered the root service in accordance with those principles, and have served as a group to maintain trust in the integrity of the service. That success can also be expressed this way, which it does in the very next paragraph. Says, from the very early days of the DNS, RSOs have undertaken both an operational and a collective governance role in delivering the root service. They've worked to assure a stable, single internet by defending the principles that make it successful against all who threaten those principles. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the very definition not just of a governance structure, but of a governance structure that has, up until now, been successful. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. No interruptions to the root server system. So looking to a governance future, the document then sets out this position: the continuing status of RSOs as autonomous independent entities with a significant voice in governance remains an important principle for the success of the governance structure. No definition of what a significant voice means. That's for the next set of discussions to take place. We're establishing the principle. So when you look at the document and you think of the process of establishing or creating a new governance structure, think of it kind of like this. If you begin with the success criteria, the success criteria clearly aren't the real beginning. It's more like RSAC 037, and even that's not the real beginning. You go all the way back to John Postel for the, and Paul Macapetris for the real beginning. But we begin today with the success criteria. We then produce what RSAC 058 calls the RSSGS functional description, or to borrow language from the GWG, what they call the model. Once you have a functional description, once you have a model that works, that people are on board with, you then translate that into constitutional documents. I don't know what they're going to be: contracts, memoranda of understanding, a corporate charter, shareholders agreement, heaven knows, and we will let other people figure that out downstream. As you settle and conclude those constitutional documents, eventually reach the point of agreement and signatures. Will there be signatures? Well, I certainly hope so. It'd be nice to sign something. But there will be a defined end point where, yeah, that's it. It's crystallized. That's what it has. All the rules are laid out. Everything's completed and ready to go. And then we see a transition to the new structure. So how are these success criteria laid out? By now, I suspect that there will be at least 10 of you who've already downloaded this document and you're reading the document rather than listening to me. That's fine. I've been doing this for a long time. I teach graduate students in cybersecurity, so I'm lucky if even half of them are listening to me at any given time. So God bless you. Go on, do whatever you want to do. So when you look at the document, what you're going to find is the success criteria are broken up into three categories. The largest category by far are the substantive criteria, section A, that deal with rights and responsibilities, that deal with checks and balances. Section B is about transition process, about maintaining stability of the root even during transition, define when transition starts. And Section 3 is what I call the clear statement criteria, and that is basically all of them exist for one purpose. Make the functional descriptions sufficiently detailed to move everyone forward, and let's avoid all of this "we'll figure that out later," or we'll give it to some sort of super powerful individual who will arbitrarily decide all those questions at some future date. We want to avoid that, oh yeah, let's push everything downstream. Let's make hard decisions now. So when looking at them as well, the one thing that makes these very, very different from success criteria you may have seen in other projects, or perhaps not, is that there is no guarantee that all of them will be completely fulfilled. There's a balance to be struck here. In fact, some of these success criteria, you could argue successfully, are in tension with each other. The obvious, the A.1 criteria about accountability and transparency on one hand, and the A.2 criteria, which talk about RSO autonomy and independence on the other. Well, clearly, autonomy and independence are great, but if you're going to have accountability and transparency, autonomy and independence have to have limits. But if accountability and transparency are great, but also you have to have autonomy and independence. So how do we balance these various criteria against each other? That requires negotiation. So now I just want to take you through a few highlights. I mean, you can read these things at your leisure, but I did want to call out a couple of them that are sort of interesting or a little unusual. One of the interesting ones, A.1.1.1, was introduced. The governance structure must include provision for cyber incident oversight and disclosure obligations, codify security, threat, and vulnerability information sharing. This came in because there was a strong desire expressed in the process of discussing this that said, look, we need to find a way to formalize security incident reporting and security management. We might as well collectively pull ourselves together and get that right. Let's concentrate that into some part of the governance structure so that we're all operating to a common standard. Why did Rob spend the first part of this talk talking about NIS2? Because, of course, we are all concerned that if the European Union can think of this, everybody else can as well. So we want to be ready with an answer to the question, how do you actually deal with this kind of issue? A.1.1.1. In the financial function, A.3, A.3.4 is one of my favorites, frankly. Methods of raising funds to support the root server system should, to the extent practical, preserve the status of the RSS as a public good, made available for no charge at point of use. The RSOs, right now the RSOs don't get paid to provide the root server system. They don't. There's no way to charge for it, and we don't want to charge for it. That's what I heard everybody say. And I know that my company doesn't want to either. But nonetheless, it's expensive. It costs money to run. So there needs to be a funding mechanism. But what we're all unified around is the idea that whatever the funding mechanism is, it can't be some ridiculous system where we're charging everybody who looks up the directory, a 100th of a penny for every look. We're not doing micropay. This is not what we want. We want the root server system to continue as a public good. Similarly, A.3.4, the governance body. If it's going to be a governance body, it has to operate on a not-for-profit basis. And also, an interesting one that some people might not appreciate, A.3.7. While the governance system must provide opportunities to finance root server operators, there must be no obligation to accept those sources of funding. Some root server operators might be constitutionally unable to accept third-party sources of funding, and some of them might not want it. So, again, it's an interesting point that this came up, that people asked for this protection in the success criteria list. Last couple of points here. Under B1, transition is conditional on prior settlement of constitutional documents. It's just kind of a way of saying we can't kick the can down the road to make the really hard decisions. If we're going to transition to a new system, you've got to get all the rules, you've got to get it settled, you've got to get it sorted. Whatever the documents are going to be, get them all lined up and get them all agreed. Checks and balances need to be clear before we have a new structure in force. And we must, over everything else, make sure that the root servers remain stable during whatever transition period comes. That is critical to the entire internet, to the world, and that's why it's in the success criteria. My last slide, here it is. You've been waiting a long time for this, so here's the last slide. What are the next steps? Well, I told you the ICANN board said, hey, love these documents. Sent them to the RSS Governance Working Group. The GWG on the 2nd of December at their meeting accepted both of those documents into their work plan. And then after that meeting was over, or during the meeting, I can't remember which, they basically asked for comments from all the RSOs on possible changes to how the GWG was structured. And those comments were made and thought about. And on the 17th of January, the Governance Working Group transmitted a letter to the ICANN board asking the ICANN board to amend the GWG charter in two very important ways. Amendment number 1, invite all 12 RSOs to the table to continue this discussion, which is now being built around RSAC 058. And amendment number 2, change the GWG decision-making procedures, because the original decision-making procedure was decide by consensus if you can, but if you can't, you can decide by simple majority. And amendment number 2 is no, let's make this, like so many other things in the multi-stakeholder process, let's make this a consensus issue only. And with that, I will be very happy to take your questions.
Excellent presentation. Thank you, Rob. This is Augie here on stage, and I'll be moderating the Q&A. Again, I encourage everybody in the room and on our platform online to ask questions.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Hello, Patrick Gilmore, Deep Edge Realty. Your last slide, move to consensus. Can you define consensus? Is that unanimous or 11 out of 12? Or
Can you define consensus? That's
well, is
sort of that's sort of like going to law school and saying, can you define reasonable?
So no.
It can be done, but you might not like the answer. It's a request that's been made, and various ICANN governance fora have different definitions of the meaning of consensus. But I believe the nature of the request was, by consensus, we mean there's nobody dissenting. In other words, everyone's got to be aligned, is I believe the request that was made. I'm speaking from memory here. ICANN occasionally uses other definitions of consensus, which basically boil down to it's almost everyone is aligned. In other words, if there's only one sore thumb sticking out, then we'll call that almost consensus or nearly consensus. I can't remember the precise term of art that they use. But like I say, GWG has requested that change to the charter, but I don't know if ICANN board has responded yet to that request.
Thank you.
Okay, we're waiting for more questions. I'm going to go with the next. Rob, can you expand on, you mentioned making those root servers more secure. Can you give us some examples of what would that look like?
Well, the security criteria that I mentioned was, first let me caveat this. If you want sort of like technical answers to technical questions, all of you need to find Ray Bellis, who's there in Texas, who runs FRoot for us, and just drag him to a bar and buy him plenty of beers, and I'm sure he'll answer all of your technical questions because he loves talking to people. Hey, Ray. In terms of the question about security and the success criteria, that's mostly about coordinating reporting of incidents and sharing information. So in terms of what that would look like, I can't prejudge it. But the kind of idea was, if we're going to have a governance structure for root server operators, if there's going to be something sitting at the center that sort of like monitors, coordinates, liaises, does all of that, then this would be a really good time to create some type of a centralized coordinated reporting authority for all of the root servers. What will that look like? I've no clue.
Gotcha. And you mentioned security management and reporting. Is it the expectation now that those things will start happening to where there is a unified way of doing reporting? Is that on the horizon? Do you see the operators embracing that and following those guidelines?
Well, the root server operators lined up behind these particular success criteria unanimously, 12-0. And when this issue was discussed, there was really no dissension in the room with the idea that we need to find a way to address this. Now, agreeing that we need to find a way to address this and we need to find a mechanism that does this is not the same thing as agreeing precisely what the mechanism looks like. But there is goodwill and there is unity of vision that we do have to put something together like this. It's what there seems to be a strong unanimity behind the need and the desire to create it.
Gotcha. We have a question online. Will the process of moving to a new GS be revisited the next time something like UN NIS2 happens again, or is there a plan to revisit it regularly?
Well, the governance structures change over time. I mean, we're all familiar with governance structures, both in public law and in private business, that are modified or amended. Sometimes that amendment process comes naturally from within the group. They decide that they want to change the rules of the game, so to speak. Sometimes, particularly in businesses, you get an intervention, a regulatory intervention that forces you to reconsider. The approach that we've taken so far, I think, is in part designed to try to reduce the need for or the perceived desirability of intervention by sovereign states. In other words, as this seems to already be a part of the multi-stakeholder system, and the multi-stakeholder system has already been more or less accepted by sovereign states as the way things should be done in this space, this gives me some comfort, and I think gives the RSO some comfort, that we're moving down a pathway that sovereign states will at least know how to embrace.
Gotcha. Another question from online. Robert, this is a lot to absorb, obviously a lot of information. Does it still address the concern of keeping the RSS out from under nation-state control? A group deciding it is governing itself doesn't preclude nation-states from deciding they have a right to override that self-governance.
All right, well, okay, then let's flip in the other direction. Let's talk about the dramatic things that states have the power to do, the nuclear meltdown scenarios. I do this with my students in teaching jurisdiction. A sovereign state has the regulatory authority to do all kinds of things. And if the sovereign states of the world wanted to just completely jump into this space, take over this, that, and the other thing and say, we don't care, we don't care about RSOs, we don't care about the RSS, we don't care, ICANN, we don't care about ICANN. It's like, this is my country, I'll do what I want with it. Sure, sovereign states are sovereign states. They have armies, they have money, they have resources, they have all kinds of things. The trick is there's a reason they don't do that. And I'm hoping that the reason they don't do that is because the multi-stakeholder system that exists is acting as a, within bounds, globally trusted mechanism to maintain some degree of, high degree of interoperability and communication, particularly at the standards level, of the internet. So if you want to talk about massive interventions, I think that the RSOs are particularly sensitive to this, because if a state wanted to take over some part of the internet, and if I were a regulator, I suppose that's where I would start. I'll turn this around. If I were a regulator, if I were king of Ruritania, and I wanted to just split Ruritanian internet away from everything else, I think the quickest way to do it would be to pass a law that says Ruritania no longer recognizes the root zone. Instead, we have the Ruritania root zone, and we have a Ruritanian root server operator, and if anybody doesn't point their DNS resolver to this one, we're gonna take you out of your house and kill you. States have a lot of authority to do bad things. But so far, with a couple of obviously dramatic exceptions, that hasn't happened. And God willing, that will continue to not happen, because God willing, we will continue to get the multi-stakeholder balancing system right. That's my hope, and that's why I think there's everything to play for in this process.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. We are running out of time, but one last question. A good question is, will the constitutional documents include a process for a change of hands of one of the root servers or for the retiring of a root server?
Well, they should, because the process of changing hands or retiring or creating new root servers are specifically addressed in the success criteria themselves. We spoke briefly about the need to address the process of how that's done, as well as the financial impact of how that's done. So if you read the success criteria, I hope they're not that difficult to read. You'll get some sort of a flavor for that. Now, in terms of how that will work in practice, there's a lot of detail yet to be worked out, and all of these criteria have to be balanced against one another.
Awesome. Again, this was a great Q&A. Rob, thanks for joining us all the way from London. And now I'm going to thank you.